Hello everybody, and welcome to a video where I will be discussing what the return of ninjutsu in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty will mean for the draft format. Before I get into it though, I want to remind you that if you enjoy this video, be sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel for more draft content, and comment below with your questions, thoughts, and feedback. Without further ado, let's dive in. So the reason we know ninjutsu is coming back is because that Satoru Umezawa has been previewed already officially by Wizards of the Coast, and it mentions ninjutsu on the card, and it feels like it would be very odd for a one-of card for that mentions ninjutsu to be in the set, because ninjutsu is a fairly complex mechanic, and so just saying ninjutsu on the card would confuse people if there weren't other ninjutsu cards. So I'm just going to go out and say that ninjutsu is probably going to be in this new set. And so what is that going to mean for the environment? So first of all, let's look at what sorts of cards typically have ninjutsu. A card like Ninja of the Deep Hours is a classic example. It has seen a lot of constructed play in Pauper, if you play that format at all. And basically, it's a stereotypical ninja in that it costs 4 to play for a 2/2, so that is not inherently good stat line. But if you have ninjutsu, it costs significantly less. It only costs 2 mana, but it does require you to return an unblocked attacker you control to your hand, and then it does have a combat damage trigger that will go off. So if it deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card. So it's kind of the classic shell for a ninja. It's expensive for the stat line that you're going to get. It has a deals damage trigger, and the ninjutsu cost is very cheap. Another example from one of the early Kamigawa sets that had ninjutsu in it is Throat Slitter, which is 5 mana for a 2/2, which is not great stats once again, but it has ninjutsu for 2 and a black, and whenever Throat Slitter deals combat damage to a player, you destroy target non-black creature that player controls. So a very powerful trigger if you can get it through combat. I would like to focus more on the more recent time that ninjutsu came around in Modern Horizons, the original one, because that was a set that has been designed more recently, and so it'll probably be more in line with what is expected of ninjutsu in today's standards. So let's start with our in-depth analysis with something like Moonblade Shinobi. So again, 3 and a blue for a 3/2, not great stats. It has a combat damage ability where you create a 1/1 blue creature token with flying, and ninjutsu for 2 and a blue. So this is a fairly standard common. And what does it incentivize your deck to do? First of all, it incentivizes you to curve out, because if you don't have an early creature to curve into the Moonblade Shinobi, you're not going to be able to leverage its ninjutsu ability, because you're just not going to have a creature to attack with. Second of all, it incentivizes you to have creatures that your opponents aren't willing to block with, or are unable to block, or that will potentially make life miserable for your opponent if they do block. It also means that your opponent is going to be blocking your creatures a lot more. It really does. It's a mechanic that thrives when you're on the play and you can catch your opponent stumbling, because if you are curving out, it means that your opponent and your opponent stumbles, it could mean that they fall very far behind. And it's just a card that overall is going to do a lot of work if you are able to start leveraging its ability and pumping out those 1/1 tokens. A very powerful ninja from Modern Horizons was Ingenious Infiltrator. It was the gold uncommon. It's very similar to Ninja of the Deep Hours. It's a 4 mana 2/3, and then whenever any ninja you control dealt damage, you would draw a card. So that would include itself. And so you'd be using something like Ingenious Infiltrator to start snowballing the game. And again, it really wants you to start it as early as possible. If you can curve a 1-drop into Ingenious Infiltrator, that is ideal. Ideally, those cards you are going to play are going to be pretty hard to block, so that they don't necessarily just fall off a cliff in the late game. And that is one of the things with ninjutsu, is that as the game goes on, the board is more and more likely to get stalled, and you're more and more likely to be unable to consistently ninjutsu your creatures unless you have a backup plan for that scenario. So it's something that's worth keeping in mind, is that ninjutsu is a very early game focused mechanic in a lot of cases, because you're getting a mana discount, which starts to matter less and less. And also your opponent's just going to start blocking your creatures, or they're going to even just have good blocks. But yeah, keep in mind that your opponents are going to want to trade if you are playing a deck that could have ninjutsu cards. So some of the things you need to keep in mind with ninjutsu is you need facilitators. And a card like Fairy Seer is actually the perfect facilitator. Keep in mind that this is a Modern Horizons set, so it is a higher power limited format generally than we can expect Kamigawa Neon Dynasty to be. But a card like Fairy Seer is really good for ninjutsu, not only because you get to play it on turn 1, it has evasion, so you're easily able to get it back in, able to get into combat so that you can trigger your ninjutsu cards. But it's also worth noting that it has an enters the battlefield trigger, which you will then be able to trigger again when you replay Fairy Seer after you bounce it back to your hand. Because keep in mind that bringing a creature back to your hand is a major cost for a card, for a ninjutsu trigger. You're oftentimes going to be putting yourself a little bit behind in tempo potentially, but if you can leverage and enters the battlefield trigger like with Fairy Seer, you're going to be in good shape. Another card that's pretty good for this sort of thing is Changeling Outcast. It says can't block and can't be blocked, so it's not really good defensively. But then again, Ninjutsu is not a very defensive mechanic, because on defense, you don't want to be tapping out for a 4-mana 2/3 or a 4-mana 3/2. Those cards are not good blockers. You need to be aggressive. You need to be beating down, ideally in a tempo setting, so you can keep your opponent off balance. And this is really a great card for that, because it's unable to be blocked, so no matter what stage of the game it is, you can get your ninjas into play for cheap. Now, a card that is also good with Ninjutsu is a card like Watcher for Tomorrow, which is a card that has essentially an enters the battlefield trigger that gets you some sort of value. Just like the Fairy Seer we saw before, this is the sort of card where you play it, your opponent, this is actually really even perfect for Ninjutsu, because your opponent is disincentivized to trade with it, because then you'll get your card out of it. But then if you bounce it with Ninjutsu, it's kind of like tailor-made for it, because that's kind of what the nature of the set was. But basically, you're looking for cards that have some sort of enters the battlefield trigger, so that you're fine if you attack with them. And if your opponent doesn't block, you can get that enters the battlefield trigger again. So that's a great way to take over the game with your Ninjutsu cards. Another thing that's really nice with Ninjutsu is cards that punish your opponent for blocking. Now, Manticore was never in a set that had Ninjutsu, but this is the sort of thing that you need to keep your eye out for, is a card like Manticore, where you attack with your 2-drop that isn't a ninja. It doesn't have Ninjutsu associated with it at all. And because your opponent is afraid of Ninjutsu, they're going to block that creature. So say you attack your 2/2 into your opponent's 4/4. If they then decide to block, then you can punish them with a card like Manticore. If they don't block, you can punish them with your Ninja. So these are the sorts of things that you can keep in mind. If this sort of card were to exist in the set, it's definitely something that you would want to maybe include in your Ninja decks, just so that your opponent has to be a little bit off balance and uncertain of what angle you're coming from when you are making those attacks that look like it could indicate a Ninja. Another card that can really be really good in Ninjutsu decks is Bounce Spells, because inherently you're getting a bit of card like value or card advantage when you are hitting your opponent with your ninjas. So typically when you use a bounce spell like String of Disappearances, another card from Modern Horizons, you would bounce your opponent's creature, and you would be spending a card to get their creature off the board, but it's only temporary, and you put yourself down a card to do so. But if you're getting value back by hitting them and drawing a card with your ninja, or hitting them getting a couple 1/1s, or getting some ninjutsu triggers going on, then it may be that the extra like attack step that you're getting, not only because of the damage, but also because of the ninjutsu triggers, will be able to make up for a card. So tempo cards can be really good in ninjutsu decks. Now, just some final tips with your ninjutsu decks. I do want to note that blue-black is typically a control deck, and it can be hard to get it out of your head that blue-black is going to be the controlling archetype, because ninjutsu doesn't play out in a controlling way. As we already discussed a little bit earlier, your creatures are understated if you're not attacking with unblocked creatures. And so you're not going to be able to play your ninjas defensively, because it's just such horrific blockers. If your opponent's curving out like 2/2 on 2, 3/2 on turn 3, 4/4 on turn 4, that sort of stat line, those aren't even like super impressive cards. Even if they were all vanilla, it could be really dangerous for you as a ninjutsu deck, because you're playing like some like cheap flyer that like a 1/1 flyer, and then all of your other cards like care about you attacking, or they're like 2/3s. And so if you are going to play a ninjutsu deck, you need to make sure you have the right mix of aggressive elements so that you can support an aggressive game plan, and make sure you don't fall into the trap of filling your deck with like counter spells and control cards and clunky finishers, because you need to make sure your deck is focused on enacting the ninjutsu plan. It's really a deck that you don't just put into any old deck. You can't just necessarily slot a random ninja into your deck. Sometimes that's okay to do, depending on if it's powerful enough. But generally speaking, you want to make sure your deck is built to maximize ninjutsu, get those creatures into combat, get them so that you have creatures that you're okay bouncing. Because again, if you attack with like your 3-drop and then you are forced to bounce it, if that's your only option for ninjutsuing, you might just put yourself too far behind on tempo to be able to recover, because you're bouncing a card that you spent a lot of mana getting into play. So you really want to be bouncing cheap plays, 1-drops, and sometimes even 1-drops or 2-drops. Otherwise it might just cost too much to redeploy the threats that you need in order to get your ninjutsu cards to work, because you can't, if you're spending all of your mana getting a ninjutsu card out and your opponent just kills it, that is a problem. One important thing to note with ninjutsu also is that if your opponent does have instant speed removal, they can use instant speed removal on your ninja before the combat damage is dealt, which will cause your ninja to die before actually getting a relevant trigger off, which can be a problem as well. So keep that in mind. If your opponent does have mana up, ninjutsuing can be risky in some cases. But those are just some final tips with ninjutsu. I'm using the power of editing to bring you back a couple more tips because I really think they're important, and I forgot to add them in my initial take. But I will say that ninjutsu is an activated ability, and so you cannot counter a ninjutsu activation. That is very important. If you're holding up a counter spell, you can't counter the ninjutsu creature going into play. And likewise, if you have a ninjutsu creature of your own, you don't have to be worried about counter spells because it is an activated ability. Another important thing with the ninjutsu is it does make timing your removal very important. If your opponent is attacking you with a creature, you want to make sure that you're going to want to kill it with removal spells before you've declared blockers, or if you aren't going to declare blockers, you don't really want to be using your removal once a creature is unblocked, because then if you use your removal spell, they can respond to it by ninjutsuing and blow out your removal spell. So know which cards you want to use removal on, know which ones you're going to block, know which ones you're not going to block. And if you are worried about ninjutsu, do remember that once they have used their ninjutsu, you can kill the ninja before it does combat damage and triggers its effect. So there is some counterplay on that axis. And if you have ninjas of your own, sometimes you might just do an attack, you think your opponent has instant speed removal, and so you just take the free damage that they didn't use when they were blocking and make them use their removal spell after taking the damage or things of that nature. So there's a little bit of counterplay there. But that is the end of the final tips section, and I'm just glad that I was able to include those bonus little tips. Anyway, that is going to do it for this video. If you did make it all the way to the end, in the comment section down below, leave hashtag star ninjas. Unlike a ninja star, the ninjutsu creatures are the stars of the show. So leave hashtag star ninjas to let me know you made it all the way to the end of the video. If you did enjoy it, remember to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe for more draft content, and comment with your questions, thoughts, and feedback. And if you'd like to support my content, you can do so via the Patreon, patreon.com/NicolaiBolas. It does help me continue to make these videos. That's going to do it for this one, though. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you next time.